You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on July 29th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. So I remember this time when in the early months after leaving a Presbyterian church I had been working at down in Orange County, I was really eager to find my footing in a different kind of Christianity. And a friend and colleague invited me to help organize a conference that was bringing together local church leaders to have conversations about loving and fully including LGBTQIA Christians in our churches. For me, this was one of my very first professional steps outside of more evangelical circles. And one afternoon, we were meeting at a large church that had generously agreed to let us use some meeting room space. And I was standing in the hallway with this colleague of mine, someone who had also come out of evangelicalism, when he ran into a couple of old friends who I didn't know. They exchanged some pleasantries, and then one of them leaned in and whispered almost conspiratorially, "Did you hear there's a Third Way conference being held here?" And he said it the way someone might whisper that there was mold in the building. Like, I can't believe those people. He assumed we would agree with him, and he assumed we were on the right side. And my friend simply smiled and kind of shrugged his shoulders, and after he walked away, we looked at each other and quietly laughed. Now, whether or not you know what Third Way Christianity is doesn't really matter. Historically, it was kind of like this attempt to reject the ordinary polarities of modern life and to refuse to simply divide everything into left and right and sacred and secular and us and them, and instead to ask what it looks like to follow Christ in a different way. And ironically, it's a phrase that's also been used more by conservative Christians to help argue that the Bible offers a third way beyond politics, though that often ends up arriving at an even more radically conservative conclusion. But in this hallway, the phrase meant something much simpler. To him, third way meant gray areas. It meant compromise. It meant welcoming queer people into church instead of drawing hard lines. And thinking that maybe truth wasn't as simple as choosing one side over another. And it was a fascinating case study to me because looking back now, I realized it was one of my earliest lessons that in some circles, holding paradox is itself considered dangerous. Living in the both and can sound like weakness. Nuance can feel like compromise, and curiosity can get mistaken for unfaithfulness. And yet, over the years, I've discovered that the sacred seems to appear precisely there in that both and space. Not in pretending there are no differences, and definitely not in collapsing everything into one, but in learning to hold what seems impossible to hold. A few weeks ago, I shared a quote from the physicist Niels Bohr that stayed with me ever since. He said, "Sometimes the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth." Isn't that remarkable? Because it suggests that reality isn't always reducible to one simple answer. And sometimes the deepest truths arrive as paradox. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever watched two people argue about something and as an outside observer, you found yourself thinking, they're both kind of right here. Not completely, not equally, but each is seeing something the other cannot. Do you know what I mean? Like it's one of the gifts of standing outside the conflict. You can begin to see that each perspective contains a piece of something larger. And let me give you a much safer example. Among basketball fans, there's what has become an almost sacred debate. Right? It's called the GOAT debate. Who is the greatest basketball player of all time? Is it Michael Jordan? Is it LeBron James? People have been arguing about this for years, and they'll continue to. You know, Jordan supporters will remind you that he won 6 championships, 6 finals appearances, 6 finals MVPs, perfect, he never lost. And LeBron supporters will remind you that he's been to 10 NBA finals, is the all-time leading scorer, is the 4th all-time in assists, has played an elite level for more than 2 decades, and continues rewriting the record books. So, who's right? Honestly, both sides make pretty good arguments. Was Jordan's peak higher? Maybe. Has LeBron had the greatest overall career? I think absolutely. But the answer depends partly on what you value, right? Longevity, championships, statistics, leadership, different eras, different teammates, different rules, different styles of play. The point isn't who wins the debate. The point is that reality is more complex, and guess what? Our opinions about these kinds of things are essentially subjective. There's no agreed upon rubric to make the decision, right? And once you begin seeing that in something like basketball, you start seeing it everywhere. Politics. Have you ever read through the platform of a political candidate and found yourself agreeing deeply with one proposal and profoundly disagreeing with another? Most of us have, right? Consciousness is another example. I was just giving our friend John some feedback on his manuscript as he explores some of these fascinating questions, right? And wouldn't you know it, a field filled with brilliant scholars, people who have devoted their lives to studying consciousness, still don't agree. Some are dualists, some are emergentists, some are panpsychists. You don't need to remember those words or even know what they mean. The point is simply this. When the smartest people in the world, using all the evidence available, still arrive at different theories or different conclusions, perhaps chopping things up into right and wrong isn't always the highest virtue. Perhaps humility is. Perhaps curiosity is. Perhaps listening is. Because the invitation isn't to win every argument. Maybe it's to become the kind of people who can recognize that there's often more truth in the room than one perspective can contain, and becoming the kind of person who can hold two truths at once in love. And something beautiful begins happening when we live that way. We stop speaking first, we begin listening first. We stop trying to differentiate ourselves and we begin trying to understand one another. We stop asking who's right and we begin asking, what am I missing here? That's where the sacred starts showing up. Again, not because differences disappear, but because love becomes larger than the difference. And maybe that's true not only in our disagreements, maybe it's even true within ourselves. Many of us have walked through difficult things, right? Divorce, loss, grief, illness, life transitions, disappointment. We've celebrated also births and graduations and recoveries and unexpected joy. Life is never simply one thing, is it? It's almost always both joy and sorrow, both hope and uncertainty, both gratitude and exhaustion. And yet, how often do we feel like only half of ourselves is welcome? A colleague of mine from my spiritual direction cohort that I was in, named Felicia Merle, wrote a book called And, The Restorative Power of Love in an Either-Or World. And she speaks so beautifully about this. She writes, I stand with love in the center, holding the hearts of my people, our anger, our frustration, our grief, our bone-weary tiredness. I hold the pain, the tears, the exhaustion. I hold our fear. I hold that place in the wounded soul that wants to strike back and seek revenge. And for a moment, with love, I'm just letting it be, not trying to fix it, not trying to bless it or send it away, but holding it and acknowledging it. I love that because it's not fixing, it's not dismissing, it's not denying, it's not over-spiritualizing. It's simply holding. Because maybe that's what love actually does. Maybe love makes room. We're usually very good at welcoming the joy, and we're less comfortable welcoming our anger or our fear or our confusion or our questions. But Felicia reminds us that love doesn't require us to remove or hide parts of ourselves in order to belong. Love welcomes the whole person. Later she writes, love has no opposite. Love is strong enough to hold all things, even your fears. Love is not afraid to wrestle or not afraid of your anger or your disappointment. Love does not ask you to hide anger or your questions or your angst. Love is strong enough to withstand the ferocity of your heart's desert storms. And love knows those things are invitations to your evolution and transformation. I keep coming back to that line, love has no opposite, because I think that's the both and, right? What if that's actually the deepest truth of Christianity? Jesus says, love your enemies, Forgive 70 times 7. And not because enemies stop being enemies, right? Not because wounds aren't real, but because love refuses to divide reality into worthy and unworthy people. Love has no other, which reminds me of another beautiful line from Scripture. In Christ, all things hold together. Not some things, all things. The image isn't that everything becomes identical, it's that everything belongs, everything is held, everything participates. We human beings are constantly separating. And honestly, sometimes we need boundaries, right? Healthy boundaries are very important. And sometimes love requires a little distance. Sometimes love requires saying no. But even then, the deeper truth remains. Nothing exists outside the embrace of love. Felicia says it this way: within the frame of both and, our story and other stories weave together in the native language of being, which is oneness. This is not oneness that spiritually bypasses the beauty of particularity, but one that harmoniously holds the complexity of all things in their distinct and unique specificity. I think that's one of the more beautiful definitions of oneness I've ever heard. Not sameness, not erasing difference, not pretending disagreement doesn't exist, but discovering a love spacious enough to hold it all. So friends, perhaps that's what we've been turning toward throughout this entire series. The sacred isn't somewhere else. It's here in beauty, in becoming, in friendship, in our language, in our ritual, and tonight, perhaps even in paradox. Because the truth is, every one of us is already a beautiful mixture of both and. We're courageous and afraid. We're confident and uncertain. We're wounded and healing. Capable of extraordinary generosity and profound selfishness. Do you know what I mean? And when we no longer feel the need to cut off parts of ourselves in order to belong, we become far less interested in cutting other people off as well. We begin to recognize that they too are walking paradoxes, complex and unfinished and contradictory and also deeply worthy of love. So what I want to say tonight is that perhaps the sacred appears whenever we refuse to cut the world into pieces that love is already trying to hold together. Perhaps the invitation is to become people who can see another way of looking at things, of having conviction without losing compassion, of recognizing difference without abandoning belonging. Because the sacredness of the both and is ultimately the sacredness of love itself, a love that refuses to let anything, not our doubts, not our disagreements, not our fears, not even our failures or our divisions, or to let anyone fall outside its embrace. And if that is true, then perhaps our calling is beautifully simple: to become people who learn to love the way love loves, to hold the world the way Christ holds the world. Because maybe the sacred isn't found by resolving every paradox. Maybe it's found by becoming people spacious enough to live inside every contrast or contradiction with love. Because the deepest truths are rarely found by choosing one side over another. More often, they emerge when we have the courage and the compassion to see more than we thought was there. The sacred dimension within the paradox. All right, I'm looking forward to talking about this with you all tonight. So here are our 3 contemplative questions for conversation. And the first question is the self question. What area in your own life do you feel forced to choose a side on something that, if you're being honest, you don't really feel is blatantly either or? The second question is the sacred question. What does it mean to you that love has no opposite? Or where have you experienced the sacred emerging not in certainty, but in paradox? And lastly, the society question. Can you think of a public issue where you found truth on more than one side? And what made that difficult to admit? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, visit www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.